Yes, I believe that we are on. Charles Moscowitz here. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. My guest is Andy Nowicki, and Andy is a blogger. He's an author. He's a he's got an interesting website here, alt-right novelist. One of the books that caught my imagination is Conspiracy, Compliance, Control, and Defiance. Andy, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
I think that for starters, could you define for us what you mean by alt-right and what that is all about?
Oh boy, that's a that's a tough one. That's like that's the history of the term alt-right. It has a history prior to 2016, but most people who are aware of the term today don't know about that history. Prior to 2016 and really before 2015, when it was kind of morphing into what it became when Hillary Clinton saw fit to mention it by name. Right. Prior to that, the alt-right or the alternative right was, I think, from my perspective, it was a fairly broad-minded, intellectual. It was a big tent of people who were outside the mainstream. Mm-hmm. It was a big tent of people who were outside the mainstream, philosophically, intellectually, politically. But I wouldn't say it was the thing that it became, or the thing that it was lampooned as, or the thing it was portrayed as later as essentially, neo-Nazism, which is after the lying media, the Lugenpress, as I call them, got hold of the term alt-right, in 2016. It was just a free-for-all, and I would just read. For a time, I was interested. I thought I was wanting to see what they were saying about it, and if there was going to be some honest exploration, some honest questions to be asked. And there, to be fair, there have been a couple of things written about the alt-right scene that seem to come from an honest place. But I would say, like 98 to 99% of what you read about the alt-right is just complete drivel, complete intellectually dishonest nonsense, and it's gotten to the point where I would like to just I played a role, I think, in the movement in the early days, mm-hmm. but I would in some ways like to just slough off the title now, just because it's so it tends to be so misleading. But at the same time, I don't want to just be defined by the way that intellectually dishonest people would define me. So I created the website Alt-Right Novelist just as a way to sell my books, or to let it be known where my books are, where they can be discovered, how they can be purchased, what they're about, and I stuck with it, and I have stuck with it until now. So, or up through now. But it's certainly true that the term alt-right has been, it's mangled beyond repair, possibly, and it's not something that I self-identify with anymore. Not because I'm ashamed of it, not because I'm running away from anything, but just because there's so much misunderstanding, really fostered by so much dishonesty from the people who have talked about it and covered it and so forth.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that the term alt-right, the alt-right movement, has been demonized in a way that's similar to the way the John Birch Society was demonized in the 1960s. They try to tag it with very, very negative images of anti-Semitism and racism and outside of normative thinking in terms of where we want to be as Americans.
Yeah.
And, I guess that, and I discovered for myself that the Birch Society was none of those things. interviewing them over the years, and I don't believe that there's any evidence of that. In fact, remember there was a big New York Times writer who referred to them as anti-Semitic, and I actually was able to get him on the phone and say, "Where's your evidence of this?" And he admitted to me that it really wasn't an actual thing. It's just this is sort of the way people see it. And as far as the alt-right goes, I mean, I don't know a lot about it, but I remember when it was demonized by Hillary Clinton, that made me suspicious of motives by the establishment to demonize it. But I guess that I have to ask the obvious question here, which is what about these charges? I mean, the ADL, which is a group that I dislike intensely and do not respect, who call anyone an anti-Semite who doesn't agree with leftist ideas, by the way. They're just a bunch of, socialists, and including Jews, they dislike me more than they would dislike, and I'm Jewish because I'm not on the left, and I'm not, I don't kowtow to this establishment view. There's nothing they dislike more than that.
Right.
But nevertheless, they've made these charges. They've actually listed you by name on their website. So what about that? I mean, is there any issue there?
Well, is there any issue with people who have objectionable ideas who are on the alt-right? I think there are people on the alt-right who have what I would think of as objectionable ideas, some of them. But for me, as far as if the question were to come up, well, why do you associate with these people? Why do you share the same label with people whose views you might find objectionable? I mean, for me, again, I was coming out of a time period, we're talking about almost a decade ago, 2010, 2011, 2012, when the alt-right wasn't really well known, but it had a very different, among those who did know it, it had a very different kind of connotation. And even then, sure, there were people, it was an anti-establishment group on the right. And so there were certainly people there, who had, who came from a different intellectual framework than that which informs me, than that which has ever informed me. But for example, there are people who would call themselves white nationalists who were on the alt-right. And I've never been a racial nationalist. I mean, I'm a race realist. I think there are differences, biological differences between the races, but for me, that's not the animating ideology for me by any stretch. But I mean, I knew a lot of these people. I liked them. I stayed in touch with them. We came from different points of view, but we shared we shared a dislike of the establishment, of the modernist liberal left establishment, and all of the ideologies that are puked out by the liberal left establishment in all of their, in all of the institutions that they dominate now, be it academia or most poisonously the media. I have grown to so hate the mainstream media over the last, say, 3 or 4 years. Before that, I didn't really like them, but I was a lot more mellow, and I kind of thought, well, they have to be honest about certain things, but no, they're not honest about much of anything. And
no, I agree with that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it was a ragtag group of independent thinkers, and some of us came from a certain perspective, or were informed by certain perspectives that were different from others of us. But it was at that time a cordial group, and it was a place where ideas mattered and ideas could be openly shared, and it was a big tent. It was an open-minded kind of you found more open debate and really less back in those days anyway. You found more open debate and less of just this tendency, which you see right now, to this what's become known as cancel culture. That there was no hint of that at all on the when I was.
It was this attempt to basically denude from any kind of discourse anything that didn't agree with an establishment left view. Okay, my guest is Andy Nowicki. He is the host of the alt-right novelist website where his books are available. Andy, I mean, I would just, it seems like it's in a way a typical conservative leaning group in that you have a vast diverse group opinions on, and in many cases, extremely opposite opinions on by a lot of different people. And this isn't both the blessing and the curse of being conservative, because we don't have these, unlike the left, which tends to be very lockstep and, they all march to the same drummer. Their arguments are more over, how fast or how slow we're going to go. Their arguments are over personalities and egos, but their ideology is really very conforming. And on the right, you have much more diversity of opinion. Having said that, I disagree with the idea that there's any biological difference between races, only because I view it as a leftist idea that goes back to Darwin, and that the eugenics movement, which was a so-called progressive leftist movement right up until World War II, when obviously it became unfashionable, when Hitler, who was, I view as a leftist and as a socialist, and who was viewed that way in the 1930s, and the war brought out a very bad stench to those kinds of views. So the left then changed their stripes a bit on those questions, but I think it's still very much in place in certain areas of thought, like the so-called studies in universities, like, the women's studies, Black studies. These things seem to promote the fact that they believe there actually is a biological difference between Black and white people, or between men and women. Well, there are biological, but you know what I mean, in a real sense. And I mean, I tend to take, I think, a more American view, which is that the individual is prime, created by the creator, and that we should have a maximum degree of control over our own lives and destinies. But so while I disagree with that view, I just want to put it into a context and point out that people on the establishment and the left who like to get a little high and mighty about this, they have their own version of it. And to me, it's not right on either side. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I there's a lot that I agree with in what you just said, and I think that I'm for treating people as individuals, not as representatives of groups. I mean, I think that generally speaking, we were created in a certain for better or for worse, in a certain tribal context, around people who share our attributes,
Sure.
and lineage and so forth. And so I just don't, it's not that I'm hardcore about race. It's more just the sense that I think that we should be reasonable about it and acknowledge things that broadly speaking are true. And I think that rejecting the notion of multiculturalism is important. I think rejecting the idea that you just throw a bunch of people together, or that you take a nation or a culture that has a set, a way of being or a set of traditions, a certain identity, and then you just open the gates and throw a bunch of people in who are completely different, who have totally different alien
even alien perspectives or traditions or so forth. It's not that these people, it's not that the people that are coming in are bad, or it's not, my perspective, and I'm Christian, I'm a Catholic. I've never seen one race as superior to another or one individual as superior to another. But I do think there's a kind of insanity to this notion of just not allowing, in particular, Western nations to retain their national identity. That's the that's basically what it boils down to.
And I agree with the idea that America has a national identity and we have a sovereignty and we have a national culture. And I think that within that national culture, we have subcultures that deal with ethnic identity, religious identity, even racial identity. And, I think that, Washington wrote about this. He actually mentioned it in the farewell address and in other writings where he says that his main hope for the future for this country would be that we would give deference to a national culture, while at the same time he understood that we would be retaining our local habits, as he called them, and our cultures. And I think that's what this country's always been about in reality and ideally. And the whole move toward like kind of amalgamation and erasing people's cultures and moving them into like, racial categories or whatnot. To me, it's a social engineering that it's not really consistent. I happen to be Jewish, and I have no problem congregating with other Jews and going to synagogue and joining Jewish organizations because that's who I am. But I do it out of choice. It's not something that I need to be identified with by others. And also, I respect the fact that you have, Irish groups, you've got German groups, you've got Italian groups. This is what America's all about. I don't see that, to my way of thinking, we don't want to have, when you say bringing in alien ideas, I don't view that necessarily as from a standpoint of heritage. I view it as more of a cultural thing. Like, for example, Islam, I would suggest, there's problems with its compatibility with American ideas of the democratic system and of Republican system. That doesn't mean that all Muslims can't be amalgamated or acclimated to America, but it's very different than the European idea, which America is based on. I mean, America basically is a Christian country, a Protestant country specifically. And I respect that. I want that heritage to be enforced, not because I think that that's a better thing, but because those are the ideas that we've embraced. And they're very, very good progressive ideas in the real sense. And to go to another cultural paradigm is not what America's been about. And I think that paradigm serves us well, and it serves all Americans well.
And you just said it's obvious social engineering, and I think you're right. I think it's being done, the open borders mentality, the open borders ideology, the people who are in charge of it, not necessarily everyone who believes in it, because there are a lot of well-meaning people who just don't see, I think don't see reasonably enough, but who don't have malice in their hearts. But I think the people who are behind it, who are largely unelected, much like the kind of class of people who now want to who now want to dictate to the rest of us how we can live, medically speaking. But just like somebody like Bill Gates was certainly not elected. Just so the people who are like the business interests and those in whose whose self-interest it is to bring in cheap labor, people like that, they're not elected either. I mean, no, there was never a vote. I mean, on mass immigration, on the allowing of mass immigration. If there were one, it would have been heavily downvoted because it's an unpopular.
It is. In fact, every president, including Obama, and Clinton publicly railed against it and talked about how they were strengthening America's borders and whatnot. The only difference between them and President Trump is that Trump means it. It's not just a lot of talking points to get elected. Trump actually is honest. He meant it when he said it, and they know that, and that's what they is the core of why they despise Trump, because Trump believes in putting America first, like all nations should put themselves first. It's an obvious thing, you know. I mean, it seems like it is a normal condition, just like we put ourselves first and our own families first.
Right.
Doesn't mean I think we're better than someone else, but it's natural. That's how we're wired. I mean, it's survival. It's prosperity. Animals understand this. I mean, you know, the bird understands that you don't mess around with its nest. I mean, it's something that's just part of normal understanding. And Trump actually is, you know, it's actually amazing to me that he is reasserting this idea, this simple idea, and it's driving people crazy on the establishment end who are globalist and who don't believe in the progressive idea of nation states and sovereignty and individual rights and limited powers. And to me, this is what this whole revolution's all about. And the fact that they would look to demonize anyone who, you know, disagrees with the globalist views. I mean, the ADL is particularly egregious. They say that anybody that talks about things like globalism are secretly anti-Semitic. That's horrible. That's ridiculous. You know, I mean, it's just, you know, it's a perfect example of this kind of nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, it's intellectually disingenuous. It's like, you know, if you use a word like globalist to describe a certain mindset, a certain mentality, and that mindset and that mentality is that national sovereignty isn't important, and you know, people should, and the borders should be thrown open, and you know, the people who live in Western countries should be demographically displaced. You know, that's you talk about that and call it globalism. I mean, it's not. That's a term that you know, checks out. It makes sense, and of course it's one of the oldest tricks in the, you know, the dirty trick of books in rhetoric. You know, to just say, oh well, when you use that word, you really mean this word. If you talk about how globalism is bad, it really means you hate Jews. I mean, that sort of thing is, you know, it's so dishonest.
Totally.
And yeah,
and they, of course, they've gotten, as racism, I think, in this country generally has receded. They actually are trying to now resort to this whole subconscious thing where someone is put under a microscope and they find a gene. They find that you said something like this. I remember, who was it, Chris Matthews said that references to urban neighborhoods is a code word for racist. I mean, you know, it's crazy. I mean, we're going to drive ourselves insane with that stuff. You know, it has to, and Trump stands up to that. And that's, I mean, his whole means of communication, it's simple and direct. He doesn't do this kind of double talk and sophistic, you know, totalitarian, you know, pseudo intellectual garbage that we're used to hearing from most of our public leaders, both left and right. Mm-hmm. And, you know, to me, it's an amazing thing to watch. It's a great lesson, whether you agree with him or not, that in terms of how to break out of this kind of totalitarian language of double talk and get to basic truths, whatever they are. Let it be what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that Trump won. I'm a little more reserved in my praise of him than some are, but you know, I don't know whether he's a true believer or an opportunist, but I mean, maybe it doesn't matter if he's doing the right things, you know, in the right ways. Then, I mean, I do, whatever I think of Trump, the people who now hate Trump are so egregious, so awful.
Really kind of out of their minds. I've seen this.
It's brought out the worst in them. Yeah. Over the last 3 or 4 years. He literally drives them nuts, and I mean worse than I remember during the Bush years, how some people on the liberal left felt about Bush being president. But it's similar, but it's a much more heightened kind of sentiment. It's like this sort of idea that if their side doesn't win an election, that means an injustice has taken place. It's like they how dare they have the temerity not to elect the person that I want them to elect? Like, it's so stupid. It's like, and you don't generally tend to see conservatives react that way to elections when they lose. When they lose, it's just like, oh, well, that sucks. I wish our guy had won, but whatever. We'll get him next time or something like that. But when the liberal left loses, it's like, I remember like them going out after Trump won the election, them going out and protesting. Like, what are you protesting? What are you protesting that the votes went a certain way? I mean,
free election. I mean, well, I think that they've shown their true colors in some of them. I'm generalizing here. In their response to the pandemic. I mean, you have people like Mayor de Blasio of New York saying that he wants to see entire portions of the American industry nationalized. You have, talk about, people being quarantined and is kept in homes and not being able to buy, plant seeds. I mean, it's so totalitarian that, I mean, I say right now, thank God Trump is president, because if there had been a liberal Democrat in office, we'd probably have martial law right now. We'd have concentration camps. We would have nationalization. It would be like Cuba.
I live in the state of Georgia, and Kemp is our governor. Yeah. And he didn't win over what's her name? I can't remember
Abrams.
The lady he ran against.
Stacey Abrams.
Stacey Abrams. It was a pretty tight race against Stacey Abrams. If she had won, and Kemp has been, I think, from what I can tell, as the lockdown has, been applied in different ways in different regions of not only the country but also the world, Georgia seems to have been one of the more mild, less draconian, less totalitarian places. Right. Kemp kept the parks open. He didn't mandate that you couldn't leave your house or couldn't drive to your house in the country like that ridiculous mayor of Michigan thing. Right. And now he's taking steps. He's one of the first ones taking steps to end the lockdown, which is supposed to happen later, like in a couple of days. But if Abrams had won, I was just thinking the other day, if Stacey Abrams had won the election, liberal Democrat, I am sure that she would have closed down the state parks, and that things would be much more draconian, and that there'd be police stopping you and asking you where you're going, and if it's essential travel, and all the kind of nonsense that we hear about going on in other places in the country and other places in the world. I mean, I really do thank God that I live in a culturally a place that's still generally culturally conservative.
Where even my state of Massachusetts, it's not as bad. A liberal Republican governor, but it's not as bad as Michigan and Minnesota and some of these other states. We can still travel, we can still drive to places. We're not like shut into the house, and it's not like extreme here. So I think that that this is the left showing its true colors, and I hope and I pray that this is going to become more obvious to more Americans, especially as we head into the next election.
Yeah, well, I mean, you had people. To me, the speed with which the lockdowns happened was just breathtaking and very, very frightening. Like, over the course of just a few days, it was suddenly, okay, everything is closed. You can't go anywhere. In many places, you shouldn't leave your home. Yeah. All of these crazy ideas, these ridiculous notions that were being that now, I mean, that I don't think there's any constitutional authority for these kinds of ideas to become law. But they claim, of course, it's not the first time the Constitution has been tread upon, but they claim, well, it's an emergency situation, so that means we have the right to do this. And then they were at first talking about, keeping everybody indoors, keeping everybody locked down until Bill Gates finds a vaccine for all of us, and then he's going to give us all a vaccine that marks us as having taken the vaccine. It was just like I couldn't believe what was happening.
Right.
I still can't believe it's still unbelievable to me. And I've been moved to write about it. I'm in the process of writing probably an extended essay about it, because this is a really, for me, it's like a moment in which there's been an attempt at a naked seizure of power on a pretext that wasn't even the pretext falls apart when you look at it that closely. That is, you look at this, I guess this pandemic, if you want to call it that. Not fine. I'll say I'll allow the use of the word pandemic, I guess. But you look at the numbers, it's not really worse than H1N1 was in 2009 or what SARS was in 2003. And yet suddenly
it's a little bit more contagious. However, there are reasonable steps that can be taken to reduce exposure. I mean, I don't have any problem with like the social distancing and not shaking people's hands. I actually think that's a good thing anyways. I think social, like, I don't know where they get the 6 foot figure from. That just seems pretty arbitrary. I just think that it's a reasonable thing for people to be a little more cautious and to, to avoid, contact with people right now. And, I don't have a problem with that, but I think that the whole lockdown business is really above and beyond. And, I hope that there's going to be a good examination of this after the fact, and that we're going to, and I think that's already happening. I think people are starting to wake up. Anyway, Andy, but I want to ask you, because I'm reaching toward the end of the program, could you let my listeners and viewers know where they can get information about you and your books and your writing?
Well, you can find me on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel, which is my name, Andy Nowicki. Just type that in and I will come up. You can find my books on Amazon, and you can go to my, again, my author page, altrightnovelist.com, and that's where you'll find information about the books that I've written. You can find articles that I've written. I contribute a lot of articles to what used to be the alternative right site, and now it's called affirmativeright.com. But you can go I think if you just type my name in a search engine and type affirmative right, you'll see the some of the articles that I've written. I was and I've done a lot of podcasting and just sort of been a figure in this dissident scene in my own way for, I guess, a good almost about a decade now. So, and of course, if you type in my name, one of probably the 4th or 5th thing that'll come up is the ADL hit piece where where I'm listed as being among all the miscreants and all the ne'er-do-wells, which, I mean, I have to laugh about it. It's actually pretty funny. So look, people can find me at my YouTube channel or at my author page, or lots of places on the internet just by typing in my name, Andy Nowicki.
All right, Andy. Listen, thanks a lot for joining me. Hope to talk to you soon. Have a great afternoon.
You too. Thanks for talking to me. Take care.
Thank you.